Good morning, everybody, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for this Facebook Live event. My name is Madhur Anand. I'm a professor at the University of Guelph and the director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research. And we're here today to discuss, in collaboration with our colleagues in the ECHO network in India, the topic of climate change. So I will just begin quickly for you all to introduce the Institute here at Guelph. We fondly call it GEAR, as its acronym, the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research, and it's an interdisciplinary institute that brings together researchers from all 7 colleges on our campus. And our vision is to break down barriers and silos within the academy and more broadly, and to find ways to humanely navigate environmental crises with interdisciplinary ways of thinking and knowing and tools. And I also want to acknowledge we're coming to you from Guelph. We're in my home office here, and we acknowledge that GEAR and the University of Guelph, Ontario, resides on the ancestral lands of the Arawandran people and treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, and we acknowledge them. And this reminds us of our important connection to this land where we learn and work. I will say a few words on behalf of the ECHO network and this campaign. The objective of this campaign is to talk about how human behavior affects climate change. And, the term climate change has been used and abused over the last few years, and how many of us understand the meaning and consequences of our actions have on climate may be also unclear. So through this campaign, we want to make people realize how small actions taken by us has much bigger effect on the climate. That's not to say that that's the only solution to the climate problem. We acknowledge that many levels of organization and government at all regions and internationally is going to be necessary. But the Climate Change and I campaign is brought to you in partnership with the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research and the ECHO Network and the Initiative for Climate Action. So the ECHO Network is a social innovation partnership steered by the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, with specific focus on increasing scientific awareness, engagement, and insight regarding India's human and environmental ecosystems. And we're so delighted to be partnering with them on this event and on a few other events that you can watch via our website on GEAR and on their websites as well. Now, the ICA, the Initiative for Climate Action, is a nonprofit organization and has a vision that imagines, enables, and accelerates low carbon and zero carbon futures of justice and sustainability. And they are starting their journey with building an ecosystem for climate action in Bangalore, India. And we're so delighted to have the director of that initiative here with us today. So that is it for the introductions. We're going to, I'm going to introduce you to, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves now. And I also want to invite you to put in some questions into the chat box, because we will have time for Q&A at the end. So let's initiate this discussion, please, by having you introduce yourselves. Perhaps we'll start with Dr. Lee.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Madar, for the introduction. So my name is Tongzhe Lee. I'm an assistant professor at the Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph. I'm director for the FAIR Lab for Experimental and Applied Economics. So in short, I'm an experimental and behavioral economist, and I mainly work on environmental economics issues. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and I really look forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Ajay, Raghavan?
Thanks, Madhur. My name is Ajay Raghavan. I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for about 20 years. I used to be with a large Indian law firm where I used to run a practice. And I moved away from the law a couple of years ago to work on climate action. I'm part of two initiatives, one called the Initiative for Climate Action, where we're a group of, like you said, about 45 people from really diverse backgrounds who are all interested in climate action and working together on it. And I'm also sort of a co-founder at something called Bangalore Creative Circus, which is really a living lab for urban sustainability. So that's my introduction. Thank you.
Wonderful, amazing. Thank you both for being with us today. We're so fortunate to have your expertise and views with us. So we're going to start right away with one question. I'm going to pose the same question to both of you. What is the understanding that most people have on climate change in your country or region? And in other words, what do people think of when they think of climate change? And let's see, let's start with you, Ajay.
Thanks, Madhur. I mean, that's a really tough question to try and generalize, especially given the fact that India has about 1.3 billion people. And I mean, literally a fifth of the world's population lives in India. What we do certainly know about climate change is that the worst impact of climate change is likely to be on the poorest and the most vulnerable people on the planet. And that we certainly have in India. We've about 10% of the population in India actually owns about 80% of the wealth, which really means that about 90%, the remaining 90% in India has access to about 20% of the remaining wealth. And that from just the perspective of being vulnerable, that's sort of quite massive in the context of India. I think India is also sort of home to roughly about half of the most at-risk cities in the world. So the context of climate change and how people sort of see that and understand it, I think is really relevant to a large number of people in India. If you ask people who perhaps live in the coast of India, in West Bengal or Orissa or Gujarat, or even the cities like Mumbai or Chennai or Cochin, or if you ask people who I guess are in the mountains or hills of Uttarakhand, where we've got glacial melting, or in Wayanad or Coorg, where we've got landslides on a frequent basis. Or if you ask the farmers in Vidarbha or MP or Andhra or Karnataka, or you ask the people who live in cities where we've got now floods and population and pollution and droughts, a vast majority of people in India are already feeling the effects of climate change. So in terms of the understanding, I think many people in India, both in the rural context, in fact, primarily in the rural context, understand the effect that climate change has on their lives. They can see something has changed. They can see that it's making life more difficult for them to live, but they don't necessarily always understand the cause of these problems. They certainly see the effect. And I think that the 10% who do have the luxury to understand the effect or the cause of climate change aren't fully motivated to try and do anything about it just yet, because they personally haven't felt as much of the impact. So it is a slightly sort of imbalanced system in the context of India, even how people appreciate climate change and understand it. I think in the larger context, climate in India is essentially seen as a carbon problem, far more than anything else. And a lot of the response, whether at a government level or at sort of even a consumer level, is really sort of looked at from that particular lens. It's really a carbon problem that people are looking at from a climate change perspective. And I think in general, young people in India have a much better understanding of climate than older people. So yeah, I think in terms of understanding, that's how I would sort of put it.
Thank you so much. I realize it was a big question, but I think you have brought up some points that we know, but it's really good to be reminded of, and also sets up the context for our discussion today. So thank you very much, Ajay. And it really is important to have all these different international perspectives. Tongzhe, can I ask you the same question? Shall I repeat it, or are you? Do you recall it?
Yeah, I have it written down, so I'll just dive in. If I may. So, well, it depends on how you define the region, right? I mainly lived in the US and Canada over the past 10, 15 years. So let me just put out the theme there. What I think of people's thought about climate change in this region, these two countries mainly, I think it's polarized. We have some people who believe in it, some people who don't. We have people who take positive actions towards it, people who don't take actions. And also importantly, there are a lot of individuals out there who just don't want to know, who don't want to think about it. Sometimes you ask people, what do you think about climate change? They want to dodge the question. They don't want to get into hot water because of a variety of reasons. So that's the theme there. So I can give you some examples of why we think that this is polarized and what kind of evidence do we have. So let's start with anecdotal ones. I've heard a British Canadian professor who works in climate change in Canada. She was trying to cross the border, go to the US and go to Maine and study climate change evidence. She was with a bunch of graduate students, and at the border, people actually gave her such a hard time. And then they posed the question, well, I don't believe in climate change. If you can show that to me, if you can prove it to me, I'll let you pass. And that was a challenge for the professor in front of all her graduate students. And you can imagine the awkwardness of that moment. And I personally I crossed the border a lot myself, and I personally have seen a lot of those kind of debates within the border staff. So I can definitely feel that moment. Well, so that's on the not so good side of things. That's when it comes to people's thought about climate change. But you also see that there are a lot of educated people who see the evidence, and they dive in, they look at the evidence, they know that this is happening, and they further do some research about why this is happening. I believe and I observe that in Guelph, most people are actually caring and they're taking actions. So we've seen a lot of more and more researchers and government agencies, so on and so forth, being more and more interested in this topic, and they're trying to take some actions. So, and of course, certainly people around me are mostly believers, and they're doing their parts, from small actions to all the way to research and to policy influences, to trying to make a change. But one cautionary tale is that I think in this region that I live in, we really need to be aware that that this is still a polarized issue. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much for that concrete example that really kind of brings together so many different things. All right. So we've touched on this already a little bit, but we're going to now move to the second question, which is, what are some behaviors that people have had towards climate change in the last few years? And do you have some examples of both negative and positive behaviors that can affect our reality in the future? And I guess I'll turn to you, Ajay, to answer that.
Sure. Thanks, Madhu. So again, I think I'm going to try and break this down into just sort of different types of people and behavior, because I think it's difficult, again, to just sort of paint a common brush over this. Certainly, I think with the conversation I was just having around vulnerability, and I think that in the Indian context particularly stands out simply because we are considered, I think we're in the top 5 most vulnerable countries on the planet in terms of climate of change. So I think with a lot of vulnerable people, what you're seeing today, at least over the last couple of years, because we finally, for a long time, we talked about climate change. Now we're seeing it play out. And I think there's a massive difference from how we used to see it even, say, 5 years ago to how people are sort of seeing it today. And that's on account of some of the reality of how this is actually sort of shaping their life. And I think that in terms of behavior, you're seeing there certainly is fear and helplessness that you see with a lot of sort of poorer people who are in sort of facing a lot of what's happening today. And that's leading, I think, to migration. You're actually seeing significant amount of migration from places that are vulnerable to sort of extreme events into cities, into sort of safer areas. Um, and that's requiring them to change their livelihood. So in terms of behavior, it's not just sort of movement and taking them out of places that for years they've lived in and sort of built their livelihood out of. You're now having to reinvent the way that they live their lives and move to new places. So I think that there is a massive sort of change in how they need to behave in response to the climate. And you can actually see this if you take examples of, say, the Sundarbans, which is in West Bengal in India, and the rest of the coast of Bangladesh. And these are areas that used to have or continue to have great biodiversity and are very fertile lands for a lot of people in the context of farming and fishing and things. And I think repeatedly every year for the last 5 or 6 years, it's been bombarded by cyclones to the extent that a lot of these areas have now been covered with salt water, and people have necessarily needed to move out. So it's not even like they have a choice to continue to live in some of those spaces. It's very similar with agriculture in India. About over, I think, roughly about 50%, anywhere between 40 and 50% of the entire population, which is about 70 million people, still rely heavily on agriculture for their livelihood. And agriculture in India is still very weather dependent. So as sort of there is unpredictability in weather, it starts to have a dramatic impact on the farmer itself. So I think that you can see a lot of sort of change in or sort of you can see behavior having to change in response to what's happening with the climate. And if you then sort of extrapolate that and sort of move that on to other people, so young people, for instance, in India have certainly been quite inspired over the last couple of years by what Greta has been doing. She, even in the Indian context, she is now sort of a little bit of a hero. And you're seeing a lot more young people take to the streets, and whether it's Fridays for Future or XR or any of these organizations, there's a lot more strength and actual sort of visibility around these organizations in India. You're also seeing more sort of push to in terms of consumer choices. So young people are asking for different and making different choices in the way they consume, and are therefore sort of pushing businesses to also respond in that sense. There's a lot more communication through young people and action. Businesses, on the other hand, as far as behavior is concerned, I think it's still slow because it hasn't impacted them as much, but there is a growing recognition that there is opportunity in both sort of green businesses as well as the threat of continuing where they are in the old sort of system. And I think you're seeing with things like ESG now becoming prominent in India, you're seeing a lot more happen with businesses in terms of just sort of change of behavior on account of the way people are reading climate change. And finally, I think as far as the government is concerned, you're seeing there's certainly a much greater opportunity for PR to be able to, given that in the international community, there's both in terms of finances as well as trade, there's a lot more pressure on the Indian government to actually respond in a favorable way, and that's then making them actually see it as an opportunity. So whether it's renewables or mobility, a lot of these things are the government is now seeing as an opportunity to move to a new space. Uh, I think your questions on negative and positive sort of behaviors or results. I think negative. I think in India, one of our big challenges still as a new and emerging economy, I think your GDP growth is still a very significant driver of decision making in India, and therefore we still have a very strong consumption market or a consumer market, which then means that resource depletion or sort of forest loss or greenwashing or many of these things are now starting to sort of come out in the context of climate, and we're quite slow to respond to many of the needs of climate. I mean, if we're looking at 2030 and the needs, or 2050 in terms of what we need to do, we still haven't got anywhere close to the momentum we need. So that's as far as the negatives. As far as positive, I think there's a lot more conversation featuring, at least in the urban context, around climate. You're seeing a lot more people with awareness and actually sort of talk, and this is across spectrums. You're also seeing more sort of leadership coming out of climate action. So more people sort of picking this up, not just in leadership in the context of social change, but also in the context of business and politics and many other things. People are using it as a method to get their voice heard. And I think finally, young people in India are definitely playing a very significant part around this. I mean, about 50% of the Indian population is below the age of 25. So it is a very relevant sort of bunch of people, and you're certainly seeing more momentum there. So yeah, that's on the positive side.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So many questions popped into my head. I'm going to save them till the end. And Tongzhe, I'm going to turn it over to you about this question about behaviors, positive and negative examples that you could share with us.
Yeah, so I think overall, in general, if you ask me about the obvious behavior about climate change in my region, I would say you see a lot of arguments over social media over the past years, and you see those kind of people on social media going against one another, which sometimes I got inspired by watching those kind of arguments. So let me give you some examples then. So if you think about positive and negative behavior, from my point of view, maybe I'm just spoiled because I grew up and live in a society where most people are around me are educated and understanding, and they're trying to have evidence-based behavior guidance. But at the same time, I feel like the negative or not so positive behavior would be some people just refuse to make a change. So they continue to do things in the old way, and for whatever reasons, status quo bias, or they just want to block themselves from new information and evidence. Sometimes people just like to do things in the old way. It applies to consumers, individuals, businesses, so on and so forth. And sometimes I don't want to point fingers at people who are trying to make positive changes. But even with people of positive intention, sometimes they got stuck into the old behavior. So that's the negative behavior that I can think of, and even worse. So are going now from just keeping the old behavior to something that's worse yet, is advocating against science and evidence. So you see those kind of behavior that exist. Well, so I can see that in the North American society, this is especially dangerous from celebrities and people in power, because they get a lot of followers, they make a lot of loud voice, and if they're against science, if they're against evidence-based policymaking, they influence a lot of people. So that's of course at the higher level of things. So well, let's stop there for the negative behavior, and I'll give some positive examples and conclude with that. So luckily, I think we see a lot of positive behavior examples. Take the agri-food industry, for example. So it has been trying to develop food products with a lot of positive environmental externalities, right? So we see biodiversity restoration, and we see that agri-food businesses are trying to develop some new products like novel foods. Seaweed products, for example, they're seeing the environmental benefits of that product, and they're trying to bring in that traditional food for other regions of the world to North America. And we see precision agriculture, best management practices, development and adoption, so on and so forth. We can give a lot of examples there. But then coming to individuals, just like Ajay said, individual consumers are more and more conscious about environmental benefits of consumable products, and that conscious actually brought people's environmentally friendly consumption behavior. And residents recycle more, conserve energy more. We see those both anecdotally and quantitatively. And finally, and I think it's important that policymakers and researchers are starting to pay more and more attention to behavioral science, and we're trying to change people's behavior bring their awareness on this issue and trying to nudge a positive change. So all of those are positive examples that I can think of, and I'm pretty happy to see the world or the region shifting that way.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure we can all think of so many positive, hopefully more positive than negative examples, and we can bring those up in the chat at the end. All right, we're going to turn now to our next question, which is the following. Actions start with motivations. So what are the main motivations that people have to address climate change in your country or region? I know we've touched on this before, but let's go a little bit deeper into this. Ajay?
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I've talked a little bit about it, but again, I think for me, the two greatest motivators that I see are fear and opportunity. I think that these sort of both these elements tend to move people forward. At least in the Indian context, you can see that for sure. I think given our vulnerability, I think there's certainly a recognition across most quarters in India that something needs to be done. So there is, I think, the inherent need to do something, whether this is at a political level or at a grassroots level. I think increasingly people are seeing it as both a very significant threat for sure, but certainly now people are seeing the opportunities arising out of that threat. I think just more specifically, if I had to break this down, I think if we looked at and coming back to the urban sort of youth that I sort of referred to previously, I think the urban affluent youth in India actually has lots of motivation because they see a very threatened future that, in a sense, they believe they can correct. So there is that sort of and in many ways, these are the people who are likely to be in positions of influence in the coming years. So I think that this group actually, and I mean, it's a little more lopsided, I guess, maybe in, say, the context of an India versus a Canada, simply because our inequality at various levels in India are far more stark. And therefore, smaller groups of people actually have far more power to accomplish things just because of the nature of how it is in India. So for me, I think that there is that motivation you're seeing, and I'm hoping that in the coming, at least in the short term, you will actually see a lot more people sort of do things on account of the fact that they are enabled to do it. As far as older people, I think that we're still, as far as motivations, it's still a struggle. We've a lot of us have been trying to sort of work with uh, people who are in positions of power to actually try and influence them to look at climate as something that is significant and something that they need to respond to. But it is a far more challenging process there, simply because uh, climate is still seen as something that's likely to happen in the distant future, as opposed to something that they need to deal with now. And therefore, most people's sort of motivation around trying to do something is a little sort of prolonged. And that's the same with a lot of established businesses in India. So large corporations that have already been here don't necessarily see this as a problem of tomorrow. They see this as a problem of a long way. So that motivation to some extent within existing systems and older people is lacking. At a government level, I think, like I talked about, certainly the sort of growth of the economy is primary for the politics and for the government. And I think in the context, at least of renewables, India has certainly sort of been able to find the motivation and the opportunity to actually become a significant player in that space. So whether it's solar or wind, or even sort of the idea of moving to electric mobility, these are areas that the government is certainly committed to and is seeing opportunity to actually become a rising sort of global power. So in that sort of context, there is motivation for the government. Unfortunately, fossil fuels and our sort of dependency on existing on the existing fossil fuel economy is still very, very high. So it's still concerning how long it's likely to take for us to fully transition or even start to transition in a sense that becomes really relevant. So that's one challenge. I think on the business sort of motivation side, like I talked about, a lot more a lot more of the international funding is requiring Indian corporations to actually be compliant with environmental and sort of government and governance and social needs. And that is prompting them to actually go out and do things. And a great example is in yesterday's news, there was one of in fact, India's richest person, Mukesh Ambani and Reliance Corporation has actually come out for the first time and said that they will go sort of net carbon neutral by 2035. And this is significant because a large part of their business is actually a fossil fuel based sort of business. So from oil to gas to a whole bunch of things they're involved in. So to actually see somebody at that level say that I am now committed to this, I think is a big step in the context of business and what it's likely to mean in India. Policy and politics, unfortunately, are still controlled by a small group of people in India. And those are also the people who have existing motivations or motivations from the past. So till we can actually find new motivations for the future, I think that is likely to be a problem. And finally, I think just as a fast growing economy, I think for us to balance development and conservation is, like most of you all know, is just a very, very sort of difficult challenge. So just sort of meeting the needs of 1.3 billion people is quite an ask for the government. So yeah.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Ajay. That's very informative. Tongzhe, I'll turn it over to you to just talk a little bit more about motivations at the level of individuals or any other level that you wish to talk about and give examples for.
Yeah, thanks. Let's start with talking about individual motivations, because I mean you see behavioral change starting from individual level, and then I'll also echo something Ajay said about business and policymakers, so on and so forth. So starting from individuals, so one thing that strikes me is actually the stories about human societies and wild animals that suffer from consequences of climate change. So well, if you think about North America, unlike in India, of course, our population density is much lower, and sometimes we don't see, especially if you live in urban or suburban areas, you don't see a lot of consequences yourself per se. But then those stories about, polar bears in northern Canada, those stories about human societies, the inequality of human societies caused by climate change in developing countries, so on and so forth. You see a lot of emotion around that discussion and that evidence, and you see a lot of behavioral changes, at least intentions built because of those stories. So I think those are really, really powerful, especially at the individual level, I guess. And then, so that's the first motivation that came to my mind. And the second would be more and more scientific evidence. Okay, so so here we talk about scientific evidence, but now more and more researchers actually realize it's not only dependent on the scientific rigor. It also depends on how you communicate those scientific evidence to the general public, to individuals, to policymakers, so on and so forth. So sometimes as researchers and as academics, we think more is better. And we just want to be rigorous. We just wanted to peel down the evidence. But at the same time, you see lower trust towards scientists from the general public. And you see that more is not always better, but it is really, really important for us to improve our communication. And we see that the improvement of communication has worked in recent years. And that's another motivation for individuals to make a behavioral change, for policymakers to focus more on this issue, so on and so forth. And also, if policymakers don't understand what our science is telling us, how can they make a change? We need to deliver the message clearly. And then another motivation that I want to talk about, well, maybe not some motivation, but it's actually causing behavioral change, which is changes in the social norm. So you think about, so Ajay also talked about younger people in India are probably more conscious about the products they're consuming and more conscious about climate change. And that can actually set the social norm in a different way for the newer generation. And also when you see people around you turn off the switch when they leave the room, you're more likely going to do that. When you see other people recycle, you're less comfortable putting your plastic water bottle into a garbage can, so on and so forth. So behavioral changes really matter, especially in influencing individual behavior. And I'll conclude with one cautionary tale, which again, it echoes what Ajay said about business. So there are a lot of behavioral economics papers about individuals, residents, energy consumption, conservation, people's preferences for a variety of goods, and how to nudge people to conduct one behavior or another. But then we really don't see a lot of evidence-based research about businesses' actions. We always assume that businesses are going to maximize their profit. And we assume that they're going to just behave rationally. They're just going to try to earn more money. But then there's not much evidence about how businesses are actually going to form their beliefs. Do they have a mission? How do they form their mission? And how different kinds of instruments can change their behavior and their beliefs. And then you see that kind of ripple effects towards the throughout the entire society because of business behavior. So, but then currently we don't have anything beyond anecdotal understanding of business behavior. I got it from India and also in Canada and the US as well. So I'll stop there for now for the motivations.
That was so great. And I'm not sure because we haven't really had a chance to talk with each other, Tongzhe, too much about these topics before this event. But there's two things I'm going to just take the opportunity to plug here in response to what you brought up. So with regards to social norms and social learning is another term that is used a lot. I have been working myself personally in collaboration with others on some of the first models of climate change dynamics that couples human behavior in those realms. So we published a paper about a year ago on that topic, and there's a couple of others who are also working on this. And this is just the idea that, you know, for climate change, we all kind of know that there's a one-way feedback or impact that humans have, and we think a lot about that one-way negative impact. But there's a lot of assumptions in our previous models that human impact, and specifically increasing greenhouse gases, which then leads to increases in global annual temperature and many other changes, that relationship somehow is assumed to be static in our models, in many of our models. And of course, what we're talking about today and what we're trying to generate this idea and share this idea is that relationship is in fact dynamic. There's a two-way relationship between humans and the environment and climate. And you've all given examples of that already today. But we have very few models which really can help inform. We need predictions. I know that predictions don't always work, right? Because you've talked about more scientific evidence not necessarily being what we need right now, because we have plenty already to affect change, right? So that the lag is in human behavior is because of all of these other things that we've been talking about today. All of the other things that motivate people to behave. We all know that humans are not rational. We just aren't, right? We don't, and our behaviors are complex and motivated by many different things. So I wanted to just mention that model, and maybe if I have time in the chat while you guys are answering some other question, I'll enter it in for everybody. The other thing I wanted to mention is what you brought up with respect to our stories, hearing stories, and emotion, although I don't put a sharp divide between ration and emotion, maybe because I am both a scientist and an artist. But in general, I don't think humans do that. we don't think so discreetly like that. We are motivated, right? We are motivated by stories and by things we hear, and we're storytelling species. Uh, and so there is a huge domain. And, in other gear events, we have brought in artists because many artists are addressing um, this, this issue from a purely imaginative artistic response. And those can be very powerful forces of change as well. And I will just mention one that I have been involved with recently, and it's an anthology of mostly Canadian artistic responses, mostly poets, but also visual artists to the climate crisis. And it's an anthology, it's a book, it's an anthology called Watch Your Head. Watch Your Head, an anthology of artists responding to the climate crisis that's been published here in Canada. Edited by a collective, but led by the writer Catherine Mockler. So let's get back to our questions. Our very last question together, and then I see we also have quite a few coming in through people who are watching. So the last question is, can you suggest 2 or 3 actions that people can take individually that will help us create a better future? And let us start with you, Ajay.
Thanks, Matthew. Just before that, I think I just wanted to sort of reiterate the point you made about storytelling and communication. I think it's just such a significant tool and often very underrated. People don't. You were talking about art and the ability to communicate. I'm a big believer in that path. So thank you for bringing it up. Just I'm going to talk about this a little bit from my own context and just sort of rather than generalize and tell you what somebody else can do. I was just thinking about my own journey and perhaps how I could sort of communicate this. So I think for me, if I had to look at a couple of actions that anyone can take, I think it starts for me with understanding the problem, and I think that is. It's not taught enough, it's not spoken enough, and it's not communicated enough. So I think that just emphasizing or the emphasis on the science and being able to pass that on to people in especially young people in really easy ways, I think is a very significant sort of first step to any sort of action. So understanding the problem. I think then spreading awareness through it and ensuring that once you've understood it, sharing it with other people, and then supporting people in groups that are working in that space. In terms of choices, I think starting with simple choices, just becoming perhaps what you'd call a more conscious consumer, where you think about sort of where something comes from, where it goes, and I guess it's sort of lifespan in terms of what it's doing while it exists. And I personally, I think just looking at my dustbin often enough, I started this exercise of pretty much opening the bin every day and looking at it. And I was horrified at the amount of things and it sort of set me on a path where I said that let me at least start by making this sort of reducing this to half. So I think sometimes just starting with simple tools about things like sort of you mentioned switching off lights, sort of using taps effectively, carrying a water bottle where you go and avoiding plastic, carrying a cloth bag instead of a plastic bag, using public transport. There's a whole bunch of things, I think, that simple things that we can all do in our own lives that actually do contribute very significantly in the larger context. And finally, I would say just actively engage. I think once you've sort of gone through this journey of a little bit of understanding and doing something on your own, I think there's a massive opportunity today to actually respond by engaging with the problem as opposed to running away from it. And I think that whether that's sort of your interest is in activism, or your interest is in business, or your interest is in sort of creating new solutions, I think today more than ever those opportunities exist. So and I think just finally ending with the fact that I think personally I believe that sustainability can be applied to pretty much anything. Um, and I think each of us actually has that ability to make a difference just by sort of starting to be more aware and do things. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Again, a difficult question, and I think you've brought up some excellent examples. So finally, Tongzhe, I'm going to turn it to you to give us some suggestions, 2 or 3 actions that people can take.
Yeah, why don't I just give 2 really higher up abstract suggestions here, because that's how I think about actions towards climate change. Nothing too specific, but I think both. I hope both are helpful, are going to be helpful. So my first suggestion is be open-minded and act open-minded. So, and I think it's important for me to stress that this goes either way. So, of course, on the positive way, or on the one way that we often think about is, let's have a learning mind of science and evidence, and then just have a learning mind and know what is happening around us, and know what kind of actions specifically can help with climate change and with humanity in general. But it is also important at the same time to be aware that people are different. People have different values and different beliefs. This comes from their different backgrounds and different, status in the society, so on and so forth. So let's not alienate the people who don't share our beliefs, who don't really believe in climate change, who are against science, so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not saying, of course, I'm not saying that you should just ignore them, right? But what I'm saying is, let's try to have some positive changes inclusively. This is not only about being inclusive of the historically disadvantaged people. It's also about some people who are in power and who are just refusing to change. And then how do you actually include them, instead of saying, you're a different generation, you belong to a different party, or you belong to some different groups, therefore we divide ourselves. So I don't think that's going to actually help the society in the long run. And then how do you actually get them included instead of alienated is something that I think we really, as researchers and individuals, we have to ask ourselves. And that's just my first suggestion. Well, overall, be open-minded and see how we can actually work together. And then my second suggestion is actually very close to what Ajay said. So, well, know that small behavioral changes by individuals matter. So you bring in reusable bags instead of using plastic bags in grocery stores. It's not only going to influence you, but it's also going to send a signal to everybody around you. You drinking out of reusable cups in a conference is not only going to conserve some resources, but it's also going to send a signal to other people around you. And I would feel very comfortable if everybody is drinking out of plastic bottles for convenience. But then I feel comfortable doing that myself sometimes, that I found guilty. But if everybody else actually starts from their behaviors themselves, and they actually give me some signals of the social norm, of course, you're going to see more and more transition from the people who from non-believers to somebody who's going to take some actions. Yeah, so I think a common misperception is that we are individuals that are too small to make real changes. I would encourage everybody to think again. When you, again, behave responsibly, you can really influence others through social norms. And finally, my suggestion of action is to take positive action today. Yeah, just know that it matters.
Okay, thank you so much, Tongzhe. I wanted to, before we take the couple of questions that have come in from the chat, and again, feel free if you're watching to put in a question. I want to mention one more thing that we're doing at GEAR. We're hosting a very beautiful project right now called Imagining Climates. It's led by one of our GEAR affiliate members. She's the director of our MFA program, our creative writing program, and Catherine Bush. And there's many things. So I invite you to come look at our website at GEAR, and you will find the Imagining Climates website embedded in it. And one of the things that I'll perhaps end this part of the session on is to invite you all to think about climate change from a very personal perspective. And what the group is inviting people to do now, whether you're a scientist, whether you're an artist, whether you, whatever, wherever you're from, whatever your perspective, to write a little microclimate story, we're calling them. And to submit it, and we will share it. And you can already go to that website and read some of the microclimate stories that have been submitted by colleagues around Guelph, and also broader colleagues from different perspectives in Canada. So we would love to hear your microclimate story. So you can go to our website and have a look there. So we do have about 3 questions. We don't have a lot of time. So I will ask them, and then, but perhaps if you could just keep your answers very brief, Ajay and Tongzhe. So I'll start with this one here. The person writes, I love this idea that younger generations know and care more about the climate emergency. Do you have any advice for the youth? How can they become leaders in their communities? Maybe I'll give this question to you, Ajay, because perhaps you are working with youth in your organization.
Sure. Thanks, Madhur. I think there's lots and lots of opportunities out there. I think not enough, but certainly a lot. And I think that, and this depends to a large extent on where you're coming from. So I think that even within your own domain, say you're a student doing engineering, or you're a young person sort of who's involved in an say in the law. I think everyone actually has sort of an opportunity to contribute to action, and there's a whole bunch of organizations today in India specifically working with young people in climate. So I'd be happy to share this with people later if somebody's interested, at least in India, in trying to sort of be part of a climate movement. We've got a whole bunch of groups involved in many different spaces where people can easily get involved, and this doesn't require a process. It's very easy to plug into these.
Thank you. I'm going to put this next question to you, Tongzhe, because it was such an interesting story you told. The person asks, so if you were stuck at that border, which your story mentioned, what would you say? If you could say one thing about why climate change is real, what would that be? It's tough. I'm trying to answer it in my mind too for myself.
Yeah, that needs a lot of creativity, and of course I'm not a climate change scientist, so not really about, I can't really comment on the evidence that we are seeing, but sometimes I got stopped at the border as well for various reasons, and I often do some environmental economic studies, and people didn't like that. What I tell people is, nowadays we just see that half of the people are against everything. Like if you take anything that's important in North America, because of political polarization, half of the people are non-believers and are against it. Are you really going to hold that against scientists? And scientists is all about, finding evidence, finding neutral evidence, and sending the message, and getting the data, and telling the story in a non-biased and non-partisan way. So that's usually my signal to all of them. And again, I realize I can't really address that specific question, just because I'm not a climate change scientist, so I don't want to give some false information. But that's the response that I often have. It's sending the message that science is nonpartisan, and science is all about evidence. You let me cross the border, for example, maybe I'll show that climate change doesn't exist in Maine. I don't know about that before. I couldn't know about that before I actually go cross the border and make some to collect some data. So.
Great, thank you. I was just thinking, for me, I would try to make a personal connection with that person. I would try to find out more about them, and then try to say something that would be meaningful, and also try to make it specific and concrete, right? Because climate change, the word is just, we've talked about how there's a problem with like understanding it and articulating it and language, and even if it comes down to like a temperature change or a certain event. Or anyway, I'm just trying to think out loud about how I might actually go about it, because it's tough, right? It sort of reminds me, I mean, because at that level, right, it's like, what are you actually arguing against, right? You almost have to just ask the question, what is it? Like, it doesn't even seem to be climate change per se. It might be a certain way of thinking, right? Or a certain perspective, that an experience that's different from yours, right? So then you have to kind of think about that. um yeah, but I also do actually truly believe that it could be futile to do it at that point and at that level, right? But interesting question. Um, but I like your response about, well, I don't know. How would I know about Maine actually until I actually go there? So, it's like kind of turning the person, the argument back on that, and putting the burden of evidence on the other side. Anyway, last question I'm going to combine two because they are related. And it's kind of similar type of question, right? So part A of the question is, some people are avoiding or ignoring the climate change issue completely. How can we communicate climate change better to encourage people to take action? And then someone else asked a related question, which is, how do I convince my family members that climate change is real? Which is maybe like the equivalent of trying to change the mind of that border guard. But maybe even harder. I don't know. So I will give it to Ajay to answer this one, and then we may have to end on that after that.
Sure. I'm going to very quickly try and sort of respond to that. I think for me, the key is storytelling. And I think Madhuri, you sort of talked about it. If you can tell stories, and stories that are relatable, for me, that's the key. I think if it's a family member, if you're going to talk about sort of melting ice caps or the polar bear, it's not relevant to them. And for a lot of people, if I had to sort of speak to my family about it, it would be about even life as they saw it, say 10 years ago versus how they see life. And I try and sort of correlate the fact that a lot of what we're living today is on account of the way that change has happened. And a lot of this, I mean, most people will tell you that life was better 10 years ago. I mean, that's very difficult for most people to disagree with. So I think using facts that are relevant and perhaps easy to relate to, and then sort of giving stories that are relatable, I think is so. Just having lots more stories out there, like you were talking about, Madhur, and whether that's using art or using science or using other sort of methods of communicating. I think if this became something that we all talked about all the time, you wouldn't have to convince people. So I think for me, that's the key.
I think that's a beautiful way to end, because here we are talking about it. We're still talking about it, and hopefully we have people also talking about it in the audience, and we will still continue to talk about it. So I'll just take this opportunity to thank the Echo Network for partnering us on this, to thank Gear for all the work in helping to bring this panel together. Of course, our esteemed panelists, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us and your research and your experience. And also thank you to everybody who engaged live with us and who will perhaps watch this video later. Yeah, please feel free to stay in touch. I would also like to remind you that the Echo Network is running a climate change and I contest, which is on, and people can submit photographs, videos, poems, anything they can think of which defines their understanding of climate change. And you should be able to get information about that from the Echo Network or from links posted below this event. So again, thank you very much to everybody for being with us today. And yeah, keep talking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.